There are moments in history when entire technologies simply vanish, not through destruction but through something far more mysterious: silence. Tonight, I'd like to take you into one of the ancient world's most puzzling disappearances. A weapon so effective that Rome's enemies trembled at its mention, yet so thoroughly lost that modern scholars still debate whether it truly existed at all. This isn't a story of dramatic battles or legendary heroes. It's something quieter and perhaps more unsettling, a story about knowledge that was deliberately allowed to fade away. Before we begin this exploration together, I should mention that this channel is dedicated to these kinds of thoughtful historical investigations, stories that reward patience and careful consideration. If that appeals to you, you're welcome to subscribe. I also share additional research materials and continue these conversations in the community tab, where many of you contribute your own insights and discoveries. What I'm about to share with you is drawn from multiple sources: the writings of ancient historians like Polybius and Livy, archaeological findings from the past century, and recent scholarly work that has attempted to reconstruct what was lost. This account represents the careful work of historians, classicists, and engineers who have spent decades piecing together fragments of evidence. The Romans were meticulous record keepers. They documented their military campaigns, their engineering projects, their political dealings, all in remarkable detail. Yet there are gaps in these records, deliberate gaps, and one of the most significant involves a defensive technology that protected Rome's most important Mediterranean stronghold for nearly 2 centuries. The city in question was Syracuse on the island of Sicily. The technology was attributed to one man, Archimedes, perhaps the greatest scientific mind of antiquity. And the weapon, according to ancient sources, involved mirrors, sunlight, and fire appearing seemingly from nowhere to destroy enemy ships. This is the story of Greek fire's mysterious predecessor, a technology that may have existed, may have been deliberately forgotten, and may hold lessons about how knowledge itself can be lost. Chapter 1. The Mind That Moved the World. To understand what happened at Syracuse, we need to go back to the man himself. Archimedes lived in the 3rd century before Christ, in an age when the Mediterranean world was being violently reshaped by the growing power of Rome. But before we examine the weapon, we must first appreciate the mind that created it. This is important because Archimedes wasn't primarily a military engineer. He was a mathematician and natural philosopher, someone who studied the world not for conquest but for understanding. Archimedes' work touched nearly every field of ancient science. He calculated the value of pi with remarkable accuracy. He discovered the principles of buoyancy and leverage. According to Plutarch, writing several centuries later, Archimedes once claimed that given a lever long enough and a fulcrum on which to place it, he could move the entire world. King Hiram II of Syracuse, intrigued by this claim, challenged Archimedes to demonstrate his principles on something tangible. The mathematician proceeded to design a system of pulleys and levers that allowed the king to single-handedly launch a fully loaded ship, a task that would normally require dozens of men. This wasn't showmanship. It was the practical application of theoretical knowledge, the same approach Archimedes would later bring to the defense of his city. The historical record here is quite clear. These inventions are documented by multiple ancient sources, and the mathematical principles Archimedes discovered are still taught today. His work on the geometry of curved surfaces, his studies of spirals, his calculations regarding the sphere and cylinder, these survived because they were copied, studied, and preserved through the centuries. But this raises an important question, one that sits at the heart of our investigation. If Archimedes' theoretical work was so carefully preserved, why did his practical military inventions disappear almost without trace? There are, as we shall see, several possible explanations. But before we can evaluate them, we need to understand what exactly was lost. According to the ancient sources, And here we must proceed carefully, weighing each account. Archimedes created a series of defensive weapons for Syracuse. Some of these are well documented and completely plausible, given the technology of the time. Large catapults that could strike ships at considerable distance. Cranes fitted with grappling hooks that could lift the prows of enemy vessels and capsize them. These weapons are mentioned by multiple historians, and their operation is entirely consistent with the engineering capabilities of the 3rd century BC. There's little controversy here, but there's another weapon mentioned in the sources, one that has proven far more problematic for historians. And it's this weapon that concerns us tonight. Several ancient writers, including Galen and Anthemius of Tralles, describe Archimedes creating what they call burning mirrors, large polished surfaces, possibly bronze, arranged in such a way that they could focus sunlight onto approaching Roman ships, setting them ablaze from a considerable distance. Now this is where we must pause and consider what we're being told. The accounts vary in their details. Some suggest a single large mirror, others describe multiple smaller mirrors arranged in a specific pattern. The distances mentioned range from a few hundred feet to as much as a bow shot, roughly 300 yards. Modern scholars are deeply divided on this question. Some argue it was technically impossible with the materials and knowledge available at the time. Others have attempted reconstructions suggesting it could have worked under specific conditions. Still others believe the whole story is a later invention, a legend that grew around the reputation of an exceptional man. But there's something worth noting here, something that often gets overlooked in these debates. Whether or not the burning mirrors worked as described, the ancient Romans themselves believed they existed. They believed Archimedes possessed weapons that could set ships aflame from a distance, and that belief, as we shall see, had consequences. Chapter 2: The Siege of Syracuse. In the year 214 BC, Syracuse found itself in an impossible position. The Second Punic War was raging across the Mediterranean. Hannibal had invaded Italy, and Rome was fighting for its survival. Syracuse, long an independent Greek city-state, had maintained a careful neutrality. But when King Hieron II died and was succeeded by his young grandson Hieronymus, that neutrality collapsed. The new king allied Syracuse with Carthage, Rome's mortal enemy. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Within months, Hieronymus was assassinated, and Syracuse descended into political chaos. Rome, which had considered Syracuse a friend, now viewed it as a traitor that must be punished. The Roman Senate dispatched Marcus Claudius Marcellus, one of their most capable generals, with a fleet of 60 quinqueremes and a substantial land army. Marcellus was known for his boldness in battle. He expected Syracuse to fall quickly. He was wrong. What happened next is documented by Polybius, who wrote within living memory of these events, and by Plutarch and Livy, who drew on earlier sources. All three describe a defense unlike anything Roman forces had encountered before. As the Roman fleet approached the walls of Syracuse, intending to assault the city from the sea, while land forces attacked from the other side, they found themselves facing an array of unexpected weapons. Massive catapults, far larger than anything the Romans possessed, hurled stones and beams at the ships. The projectiles came from behind the high walls, giving the Roman soldiers no target to strike back against. When the ships attempted to move closer, thinking they would be safer beneath the trajectory of the catapults, smaller weapons opened fire, devices that could be quickly adjusted to hit targets at varying distances. According to Polybius, these weapons created chaos among the Roman crews. But it was what happened next that truly unnerved the Romans. Plutarch, in his Life of Marcellus, describes how Archimedes had positioned defensive mechanisms along the walls, devices that remained hidden until the Romans came within range. Some of these were the cranes we mentioned earlier, mechanical arms that would suddenly extend out over the walls, drop grappling hooks onto the prows of ships, and then lift them partially out of the water before dropping them, often causing them to capsize or take on water. These crane devices are mentioned by all the major sources, and there's little doubt they existed. They represent impressive engineering, but nothing that violates our understanding of ancient technology. But several sources also mention another type of weapon, one that set ships aflame. The accounts are frustratingly vague on exactly how this was accomplished. Anthemius of Tralles, writing 7 centuries later, but claiming to draw on older sources, specifically mentions burning mirrors used to focus sunlight onto the sails and wooden hulls of the Roman vessels. It's worth pausing here, because this detail changes how we see everything that follows. If such weapons existed, and I emphasize the conditional here, they would represent a remarkable understanding of optics and heat concentration. Archimedes had written treatises on mirrors and reflection. He understood geometric optics. The question isn't whether he possessed the theoretical knowledge, but whether he could apply it practically. What we know with certainty is how the Romans reacted. Marcellus, according to Polybius, was forced to abandon his naval assault entirely. The normally aggressive general ordered his fleet to withdraw and maintain a blockade at a safe distance. The land assault fared little better, with the defenders using their superior position and Archimedes' defensive weapons to repel every attempt to scale or undermine the walls. The siege, which Marcellus expected to last weeks, dragged on for nearly 2 years. The Romans eventually took the city, not through military prowess but through betrayal. Someone opened a gate, and Roman soldiers flooded in during a festival when the defenders were distracted. What happened next is one of history's great tragedies, and it's crucial to our understanding of why the technology was lost. Marcellus, according to all sources, had given specific orders that Archimedes was to be taken alive. The general wanted to meet the mind that had thwarted Rome's might for so long. But in the chaos of the sacking, a Roman soldier found an elderly man drawing geometric figures in the sand, apparently so absorbed in his calculations that he didn't notice the city falling around him. When the soldier demanded he come with him, Archimedes reportedly asked for a moment to complete his proof. The soldier, insulted or perhaps just frightened by the fall of the city, struck him down. Marcellus, we're told, wept when he learned what had happened. He gave Archimedes an honorable burial, but the knowledge that died with him, the practical application of his theoretical work, was lost. Or was it? Chapter 3. The evidence for the burning mirrors. Let us now examine the evidence for the burning mirrors with the care it deserves. This is where historians must weigh competing accounts, consider the reliability of sources, and acknowledge the limitations of what we can know with certainty. The earliest mention comes from Galen, the Greek physician and philosopher who lived in the 2nd century AD, some 350 years after the siege of Syracuse. Galen doesn't provide details, but he mentions in passing that Archimedes used burning mirrors in the defense of his city. This is significant because Galen was writing about optics and vision, not military history. He mentions it as a known fact, suggesting it was part of the common understanding of Archimedes' work. Lucian, writing around the same time, also makes reference to the burning mirrors, again treating it as established knowledge rather than speculation. The most detailed account comes much later, from Anthemius of Tralles, a mathematician and architect who lived in the 6th century AD. Anthemius was one of the designers of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, so he was no fool when it came to practical engineering. He wrote a treatise on burning mirrors and claimed to be working from earlier sources about Archimedes' work. Anthemius describes an arrangement of multiple hexagonal mirrors that could be individually adjusted to focus sunlight onto a single point. But, and this is crucial, the 2 earliest and most reliable historians of the siege, Polybius and Livy, don't mention burning mirrors at all. They described the cranes, the catapults, the various mechanical devices, but say nothing about fire weapons using mirrors. This silence is significant. Polybius wrote his history within decades of the events, when eyewitnesses would still have been alive. If burning mirrors had been a dramatic part of the defense, wouldn't he have mentioned them? There are two ways to interpret this silence, and I'd be interested to know how you interpret this when we're finished. One interpretation is that the burning mirrors never existed, that they're a later legend that grew around Archimedes' reputation. As centuries passed, and his mathematical genius became more celebrated, later writers perhaps added increasingly miraculous weapons to his arsenal. This is a common pattern in ancient historiography. Heroes accumulate legends. The second interpretation is more intriguing, and it's one that several modern scholars have proposed. Perhaps the burning mirrors were deliberately omitted from the early accounts. Perhaps there were reasons why this particular technology wasn't meant to be widely known or understood. In more recent times, various researchers have attempted to determine whether burning mirrors would have been practically feasible with 3rd century BC technology. The results of these experiments have been mixed, which only deepens the mystery. In 1973, a Greek scientist named Ioannis Sarkas conducted an experiment using 70 mirrors, each about 5 feet by 3 feet, arranged to focus sunlight onto a wooden boat at a distance of about 160 feet. According to the published reports, the boat caught fire within minutes. This experiment has been cited by those who believe the burning mirrors were real. However, critics point out several problems with this and similar experiments. The conditions were ideal: perfect weather, a stationary target, mirrors that could be carefully aligned in advance. In actual combat, with moving ships, waves, soldiers under attack from conventional weapons, and the need to quickly target different vessels, would such a system have been practical? A 2005 experiment conducted by students at MIT attempted to replicate the feat. They found they could char wood and create some smoke, but achieving actual combustion proved difficult. The target had to remain perfectly still for an extended period, and the angles had to be precisely maintained. Yet other researchers have suggested that Anthemius's description, using multiple smaller mirrors rather than one large one, would have been more practical. Each mirror could be operated by a different person, all focusing on a single point. This distributed system would have been easier to adjust and aim, but here's where the question becomes more interesting. Even if the technology was possible, even if it worked under certain conditions, why was it lost so completely? The Romans conquered Syracuse. They captured the city, its treasures, its documents. Roman generals prided themselves on adopting the best technology of conquered peoples. They learned siege warfare from the Greeks, ship design from the Carthaginians, metalworking techniques from the Gauls. Rome was nothing if not practical. They took what worked, so why didn't they take the burning mirrors? Several explanations have been proposed. Perhaps the technology was less effective than the sources suggest, and the Romans simply didn't think it worth preserving. Perhaps it required specific conditions, certain weather, certain target distances, that made it unreliable as a general weapon. Or perhaps, and this is worth considering, there was something about the technology that made it dangerous to preserve, something that suggested it should be forgotten. This might seem like speculation, but there's a precedent. The Romans themselves later possessed a weapon called Greek fire, an incendiary compound whose exact composition was a closely guarded state secret. The Byzantine Empire, Rome's successor in the East, protected the formula so carefully that it was eventually lost when the last craftsmen who knew how to make it died without passing on their knowledge. Could something similar have happened with Archimedes' burning mirrors? Could knowledge have been deliberately restricted, shared only among a small group, until eventually it died with them? Chapter 4. The Nature of Lost Knowledge. It's worth stepping back from the specific case of the burning mirrors to consider a broader question. How does knowledge become lost? Not destroyed in a single catastrophic event, but gradually forgotten, allowed to slip away through neglect or intention. History provides numerous examples. The Romans themselves knew how to make a type of concrete that could set underwater and last for millennia, far more durable than most modern concrete. The Pantheon in Rome, built nearly 2,000 years ago, still stands with its massive unreinforced concrete dome. Yet, the exact formula for this remarkable material was lost during the Middle Ages, and only recently rediscovered through chemical analysis. The technique for creating Damascus steel, blades of legendary sharpness and flexibility, was lost sometime around the 18th century. Despite extensive research, modern metallurgists still debate exactly how it was made. In the Americas, the Inca built stone structures with such precision that modern engineers struggle to understand how they achieved such tight joints without mortar, using only stone tools. The techniques were lost when Spanish conquest disrupted the traditional systems of knowledge transmission. What all these examples share is a common pattern: specialized knowledge that was held by a relatively small number of practitioners, transmitted through direct teaching and hands-on experience rather than written documentation, and dependent on specific social or economic conditions to support the craftsmen who possessed it. When those conditions changed, when empires fell, trade routes were disrupted, or economic systems collapsed, the knowledge went with them. Written descriptions might survive, but without the practical experience to interpret them, they become almost meaningless. Archimedes could write about the geometry of parabolic mirrors, but unless someone had actually built and used them, those writings wouldn't enable future generations to recreate the technology. This is particularly true for technologies that require not just knowledge but skill, the kind of practical expertise that can only be developed through years of practice and direct instruction. A medieval text might describe the process of making stained glass, but without someone to show you exactly how hot the furnace should be, precisely when to add each ingredient, how to tell by color and consistency when the glass is ready, the written description alone isn't enough. But there's another way knowledge can be lost, one that's more troubling to consider: deliberate suppression. Throughout history, certain types of knowledge have been restricted, controlled, or actively destroyed because they were considered dangerous, heretical, or threatening to established power. The ancient mystery religions kept their central practices secret, revealing them only to initiated members. Alchemists wrote in deliberately obscure language to prevent the uninitiated from attempting dangerous procedures. Medieval guilds closely guarded their trade secrets, threatening members who revealed techniques to outsiders. In some cases, this restriction was practical, preventing people from attempting procedures they didn't fully understand. In other cases, it was about maintaining power and economic advantage. And in some instances, it reflected a genuine belief that certain knowledge was too dangerous to be widely shared. Could the burning mirrors have fallen into this category? There's an argument to be made that they could have. A weapon that could set fire to ships from a distance, without conventional projectiles or visible mechanisms. Such a thing might have seemed almost magical to ancient observers. In a world where much of military and political power rested on physical might and visible demonstrations of strength, a weapon that struck invisibly, using nothing but sunlight, might have been viewed as unsettling, perhaps even impious. The Romans were practical, yes, but they were also deeply superstitious. They regularly consulted augurs before military campaigns, seeking signs from the gods. A weapon that seemed to call down fire from the heavens might have been rejected, not because it didn't work, but because it worked in a way that made them uncomfortable. So far we've seen how Archimedes, a mathematician and natural philosopher, came to create defensive weapons for his native Syracuse. We've examined the historical evidence for burning mirrors, weighing ancient testimonies against modern experiments. And we've considered the various ways in which technological knowledge can be lost, whether through accident, neglect, or deliberate choice. Next, we'll explore what happened to the knowledge of burning mirrors in the centuries after Syracuse fell, tracing how it appeared, disappeared, and occasionally resurfaced in the historical record, leaving us with a puzzle that remains unsolved today. What we'll find is a pattern that suggests something more complex than simple forgetting. Chapter 5: Echoes Through the Centuries. The story of burning mirrors didn't end with the fall of Syracuse. References to the technology surface periodically throughout the classical and medieval periods, appearing in contexts that raise as many questions as they answer. In the 6th century AD, as we mentioned earlier, Anthemius of Tralles not only wrote about Archimedes burning mirrors, but claimed to have constructed something similar himself. Anthemius was no idle theorist. He was the mathematical architect who helped design the Hagia Sophia, one of the great engineering achievements of the Byzantine Empire. According to the historical record, he demonstrated his burning mirrors to the Byzantine court. What's particularly intriguing is that Anthemius lived during the reign of Justinian I, a period when the Byzantine Empire was actively seeking military advantages against its enemies. The Byzantines were engaged in constant warfare on multiple fronts, against the Persians to the east, against various groups along the Danube frontier, and in attempting to reconquer former Roman territories in the west. This was also the same general period, though the exact dating is debated, when the Byzantines first employed Greek fire, that mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn on water and struck terror into enemy fleets for centuries. The connection is worth noting. Here was an empire that clearly valued unusual fire weapons and was willing to invest in their development and production. Yet there's no record of Anthemius's burning mirrors ever being deployed in actual combat. They were demonstrated, apparently successful in those demonstrations, and then nothing. The technology, if it existed, wasn't adopted into the Byzantine arsenal. The knowledge trail becomes even more interesting when we follow it into the Islamic world. During the Islamic Golden Age, roughly the 8th through 13th centuries, Muslim scholars preserved, translated, and expanded upon Greek scientific texts. They were particularly interested in optics. Ibn al-Haytham, known in the West as Al-Hazan, conducted groundbreaking research on the nature of light and vision in the 11th century. His work on curved mirrors and the focusing of light was remarkably sophisticated. He understood the geometry of parabolic mirrors and how they could concentrate sunlight to a focal point. Other Islamic scholars of this period also wrote about burning mirrors. Al-Kindi discussed them in the 9th century. Ibn Sal, working in the 10th century, made advances in understanding refraction and lens design that wouldn't be matched in Europe for centuries. Here's what's fascinating about these Islamic sources. They discuss burning mirrors as theoretical possibilities and describe their geometric principles in detail. They clearly understood how such devices could work. Several claim to have constructed small versions for demonstration purposes. But, and this is the pattern we keep seeing, there's no evidence they were ever used militarily, despite the Islamic world being engaged in continuous warfare during this period. These weren't primitive or superstitious societies. They had the mathematical knowledge, the metalworking capabilities, and certainly the military need. Yet something kept burning mirrors in the realm of scientific curiosity, rather than practical weaponry. When Greek and Arabic texts on optics reached medieval Europe, European scholars became similarly intrigued by burning mirrors. Roger Bacon, the 13th century philosopher and scientist, wrote about them extensively. He understood the theory and seemed convinced they were possible. Leonardo da Vinci, in his notebooks, sketched designs for large concave mirrors that might be used to focus sunlight. His drawings show he grasped the geometric principles involved. During the Renaissance, as interest in classical knowledge surged, the story of Archimedes and his defense of Syracuse was retold and elaborated. The burning mirrors became an established part of the narrative, a symbol of ancient scientific achievement. Yet once again, despite numerous wars, sieges, and naval battles during this period, no European power appears to have successfully deployed burning mirrors as weapons. The idea remained perpetually on the edge of realization, discussed in learned treatises, but absent from the practical manuals of military engineers. What emerges from this historical survey is a curious pattern. Across multiple civilizations, over more than 1,000 years, the idea of burning mirrors recurs. Scholars in each era claim to understand the principles. Some claim to have constructed working versions. The technology seems perpetually on the verge of being realized, but it never quite crosses over into practical military use. It remains in a strange liminal space, more than pure myth, because serious scientists and engineers kept taking it seriously, but less than established technology, because it was never reliably deployed in the manner the ancient sources described. This pattern suggests something important about the nature of the mystery we're investigating. If burning mirrors were simply impossible with pre-modern technology, we might expect the idea to have been abandoned once mathematical analysis showed it couldn't work. If they were straightforward and effective, we'd expect them to have been widely adopted, with descriptions appearing in military manuals and records of their use in battles. Instead, what we find is this persistent intermediate state, possible enough that each generation of scholars investigates it anew, problematic enough that it never becomes standard practice. It's as if the technology exists at the very edge of feasibility, requiring conditions or knowledge that were rarely achieved. Chapter 6: Modern Investigations and Theories. In the modern era, with advanced materials, precise measurements, and controlled experimental conditions, researchers have attempted to definitively answer whether Archimedes' burning mirrors were plausible. What they've discovered is that the question is more complex than it initially appears. The experiments I mentioned earlier, Sacker's in 1973, MIT in 2005, represent only a small sample of the investigations conducted. Each experiment has taught us something about the possibilities and limitations of burning mirrors, but none has provided a conclusive answer that satisfies all scholars. What emerges from these modern investigations is an interesting realization. The question isn't simply could burning mirrors work, but rather under what specific conditions could they work, and were those conditions present at Syracuse? Let's consider the practical requirements for an effective burning mirror weapon based on what modern experiments have revealed. This will help us understand what Archimedes would have needed to achieve. First, the mirrors themselves. Bronze was the primary material available for ancient mirrors, and while it can be polished to a high reflectivity, it's not as efficient as modern silver-backed glass. This means more mirror surface area would be needed to achieve the same effect. The mirrors would also need to be kept clean and repolished regularly. Exposure to salt air in a coastal city would quickly degrade their effectiveness. Second, the targeting problem. Ships don't remain stationary, they bob on waves, move with wind and current, and once under attack would be actively trying to maneuver away. This means the mirrors would need to be constantly adjusted to maintain their focus on the target. Modern experiments that successfully ignited wood typically required the target to remain motionless for several minutes. Third, the weather dependency. Burning mirrors require direct, strong sunlight, cloud cover, haze, or the angle of the sun at different times of day would all affect their effectiveness. Syracuse is in the Mediterranean, which has many sunny days, but not exclusively. A weapon that only works under perfect conditions is of limited military value. Fourth, the range problem. The farther away the target, the larger the mirror array needs to be to focus enough energy. But the farther away the target, the more any small error in alignment is magnified. Modern experiments suggest effective range might have been a few hundred feet at most, well within range of conventional catapults and archers. But here's something that often gets overlooked in these discussions. Even if burning mirrors had limited effectiveness by themselves, they might have been devastatingly effective as part of an integrated defensive system. Consider the psychological impact. Roman sailors approaching Syracuse's walls were already facing massive catapults and mechanical cranes that could capsize ships. Now add to this the possibility, even if it only worked occasionally, under the right conditions, of ships bursting into flame through no visible cause. The uncertainty and fear this would generate might be as valuable as the physical damage. Moreover, if burning mirrors could be used selectively against specific high-value targets, perhaps the flagship of the Roman fleet, or ships carrying commanders, their limited effectiveness might not matter. Ancient warfare was often decided by the morale and cohesion of forces as much as by body counts. This brings us back to Plutarch's account of Marcellus's reaction. The Roman general, frustrated by weapons he couldn't effectively counter, withdrew his fleet and settled in for a long siege. Whether or not burning mirrors were primarily responsible, something convinced one of Rome's most aggressive generals that naval assault was futile. Some modern scholars have proposed that the burning mirrors described in later sources might have been a garbled account of something else entirely, perhaps incendiary projectiles or primitive flamethrowers. The ancient world did have fire weapons. Flaming arrows had been used for centuries. More sophisticated incendiary compounds, mixtures of pitch, sulfur, and other materials were known. Some historians suggest that what Anthemius and others described as burning mirrors might have been a misunderstanding or mythologization of more conventional fire weapons. It would explain why reliable early sources like Polybius don't mention burning mirrors, because they were describing the actual weapons used, which were conventional if sophisticated incendiaries. Later writers, knowing Archimedes' reputation and his work on optics, might have conflated different stories and created the burning mirrors legend. However, this explanation has its own problems. Why would multiple later writers, many of them sophisticated mathematicians and engineers, describe burning mirrors in such specific geometric and optical terms if they were simply inventing a legend? Anthemius's treatise doesn't read like mythology, it reads like an engineering manual. Another theory, proposed by some historians of science, is that burning mirrors might have worked but were abandoned for practical reasons that had nothing to do with their effectiveness. Perhaps they required specialized craftsmen to build and maintain. Perhaps the knowledge of how to properly align and use them was too complex to be easily transmitted. Perhaps they were expensive to construct relative to their military utility. If burning mirrors were on the borderline of practical feasibility, working sometimes but not reliably, effective under certain conditions but not others, then their gradual abandonment becomes understandable. Why invest in a complex, expensive, weather-dependent weapon when conventional catapults worked reliably in all conditions? Yet this still doesn't fully explain the pattern we've observed, the recurring interest across centuries and cultures, with scholars repeatedly returning to the concept as if convinced it held some value that remained just out of reach. Chapter 7. What was really lost? Perhaps we've been asking the wrong question all along. Instead of fixating on whether burning mirrors physically worked as described, we might consider what the loss of this technology, or the legend of this technology, represents about how knowledge itself is preserved or forgotten. What if the real secret wasn't the mirrors themselves, but the approach to problem solving that created them? Archimedes was remarkable not just for what he invented, but for how he thought. He approached practical problems through theoretical understanding. He used mathematics to solve engineering challenges. He saw connections between abstract geometry and physical reality. This way of thinking, systematic, mathematical, experimental, was rare in the ancient world. Most technology developed through trial and error, with craft knowledge passed down through apprenticeship. Archimedes represented a different approach, using fundamental principles to predict what would work before building it. When Archimedes died, Rome lost not just a clever inventor, but a particular method of innovation, and perhaps that's the loss that matters most. To understand this, we need to consider how the Romans typically dealt with technology. They were magnificent engineers. Their roads, aqueducts, and buildings still stand 2 millennia later. But Roman engineering was primarily empirical. They learned what worked through experience, codified it in practice, and scaled it up through superior organization and resources. The Romans excelled at taking existing technologies and improving them through systematic application. They didn't invent the arch, but they perfected its use in bridges and buildings. They didn't invent concrete, but they developed it into a material that could be used for structures of unprecedented size and durability. What the Romans were less good at was the kind of theoretical innovation that Archimedes represented. They could recognize good ideas when they saw them and implement them brilliantly. But generating fundamentally new ideas from first principles, that wasn't their strength. When Roman soldiers killed Archimedes, they destroyed one of the few minds in the ancient Mediterranean capable of that kind of innovation. And Rome's culture, practical, empirical, focused on what could be immediately deployed and replicated, wasn't set up to recognize what they'd lost until it was too late. This brings us to a fundamental problem with how knowledge survives or disappears. Written records aren't enough. You can preserve books, but if the books describe techniques that require tacit knowledge, the kind of understanding that comes from actually doing something, then the written record becomes nearly useless without practitioners to interpret it. Archimedes wrote treatises on mathematics and optics that survived because they were abstract enough to be understood by later mathematicians reading them. But if he also possessed practical knowledge about how to construct and aim burning mirrors effectively, knowledge gained through trial and error, through adjustment and refinement, that knowledge would have died with him. This is the tragedy that historians of technology often encounter. Ancient texts will describe a device or technique in what seems like adequate detail, but when modern researchers attempt to recreate it, based solely on those descriptions, they find crucial information is missing. The text assumes knowledge the original readers would have had, knowledge so obvious to contemporaries that no one thought to write it down. Consider a simple example from more recent history. Medieval recipes for bread exist in abundance, but they rarely specify exact quantities or temperatures. They'll say things like knead until ready, or bake in a hot oven. To a medieval baker with years of experience, this was perfectly clear. To us, reading centuries later, it's frustratingly vague. What does ready look like? How hot is hot? Now imagine trying to reconstruct something far more complex, a sophisticated optical weapon based on ancient descriptions written for readers who might have seen such devices in operation, or at least understood the craft traditions of mirror making and bronze working that supported them. The writings of Archimedes that survived are his mathematical works, pure geometry, calculations of areas and volumes, studies of mechanical advantage. These are timeless because they're abstract. But his practical engineering knowledge, how to select and polish bronze to optimal reflectivity, how to construct mounting systems that allowed precise adjustment, how to train operators to coordinate multiple mirrors on a moving target. None of this was written down in a way that survived, if it was written down at all. And so we're left with a gap in the historical record. We have descriptions of what the burning mirrors supposedly did. We have the mathematical principles that would make them theoretically possible. But we don't have the practical knowledge that would bridge the gap between theory and working technology. Chapter 8. The broader pattern of lost knowledge. The burning mirrors of Archimedes, whether they fully existed or not, represent a pattern we see repeated throughout history, knowledge that exists in a fragile form, dependent on specific individuals or small communities, and vulnerable to disruption. Greek fire, which we've mentioned several times, is perhaps the most famous example from the ancient world. This incendiary weapon was used by the Byzantine Empire with devastating effect for centuries. Contemporary accounts describe it as a liquid that burned even on water, that couldn't be extinguished by conventional means, and that struck terror into enemy fleets. The Byzantines guarded the secret of Greek fire jealously. It was manufactured in only one location in Constantinople, with the knowledge held by a small number of craftsmen who passed it down through family lines. The emperor himself swore oaths never to reveal the secret to foreign powers. And then, sometime between the 12th and 13th centuries, the knowledge was lost. The line of craftsmen was broken, perhaps by death, perhaps by political upheaval. Written descriptions survived, but they were deliberately vague, obscure, or incomplete to prevent enemies from replicating the weapon. Without the practical knowledge to interpret these descriptions, later generations couldn't recreate Greek fire. Modern chemists have proposed various formulas, combinations of petroleum, quicklime, sulfur, and other ingredients. But we can't be certain any of them match the original. The secret is truly lost. We cannot discuss lost ancient knowledge without mentioning the Library of Alexandria, though the reality is more nuanced than the popular narrative of a single catastrophic burning. The Library of Alexandria, founded in the 3rd century BC, around the same time Archimedes was working in Syracuse, was the greatest repository of knowledge in the ancient world. At its height, it reportedly contained hundreds of thousands of scrolls, covering every field of learning known to the Hellenistic world. But the library didn't disappear in one dramatic event. Instead, it declined over centuries through a combination of political instability, reduced funding, occasional fires, and changing priorities. Scrolls were lost, damaged, or simply not copied when they wore out. Knowledge that existed in only one or a few copies disappeared without anyone necessarily noticing it was gone. This gradual erosion is in many ways more insidious than dramatic destruction. At least a catastrophic fire prompts efforts to remember and record what was lost. Slow decline allows things to slip away quietly, with each generation slightly less informed than the last, until eventually no one remembers what questions they should be asking. How many works by Archimedes were lost this way? We know of several treatises by him that are mentioned in ancient sources but no longer exist. One, on sphere making, apparently described mechanical devices including models of the planets and stars. Another work on water clocks is mentioned but lost. These weren't just theoretical works. They described practical engineering. Could one of these lost works have contained the practical details of burning mirrors? We'll never know because the scrolls are gone, and we can't even be certain what their complete titles were, let alone their contents. The fall of the Western Roman Empire brought another massive disruption to the preservation of knowledge. This wasn't simply about barbarian invasions, though those certainly didn't help. It was about the collapse of the economic and social systems that had supported educated elites, professional scribes, and the leisure necessary for scholarship. In the chaos of the 5th and 6th centuries, maintaining libraries became a low priority compared to basic survival. Scrolls required constant copying to preserve them. Parchment and papyrus deteriorate, especially in damp climates. Without scribes to do this copying work, texts simply rotted away. What survived was what the Christian monasteries chose to preserve. And their choices were understandably selective. They prioritized religious texts, certainly. They preserved some classical philosophy and literature, particularly works that could be reconciled with Christian doctrine. They maintained practical knowledge about agriculture, basic medicine, and other immediately useful topics. But sophisticated mathematical treatises on optics, detailed engineering manuals for military devices, these were lower priorities. Many simply weren't copied, and so were lost. We're fortunate that Archimedes' mathematical works were preserved, probably because they were recognized as foundational to geometry. But his practical engineering knowledge, the hands-on expertise that made him dangerous to Rome, that was exactly the sort of information that might have seemed less important to medieval monks working by candlelight, carefully choosing which ancient texts deserved their precious parchment and labor. The pattern we're seeing reveals something important about how knowledge actually works, as opposed to how we sometimes imagine it works. We tend to think of knowledge as something that, once discovered, becomes permanently available to humanity, added to the great store of things we know. But this isn't accurate. Knowledge is more like a garden than a warehouse. It requires constant maintenance, active cultivation, and the right conditions to survive. Let those conditions deteriorate, and knowledge can vanish with shocking speed. The burning mirrors, whether they worked as described or were something less miraculous, represent this fragility perfectly. Here was a technology or technique that was apparently viable enough to be taken seriously by multiple civilizations across 1,000 years. Yet at no point did it become sufficiently established, widely understood, or economically valuable to guarantee its survival. It existed in that dangerous middle ground, sophisticated enough to require specialized knowledge, but not quite reliable or cost-effective enough to become standard practice. The kind of knowledge that depends on a few dedicated individuals to preserve it, and disappears when those individuals are gone. This fragility should concern us even today, in our age of digital storage and global communication. We assume that because information can be copied endlessly and distributed worldwide, it's safe. But information without understanding is just data. The practical knowledge, the tacit expertise, the accumulated wisdom of how to actually do things, this still resides primarily in human minds and human communities. And it's still vulnerable. Chapter 9. The lesson for our time. The story of Archimedes' burning mirrors isn't just ancient history. It's a pattern that continues to play out in our own time, though we often don't recognize it until the knowledge is already gone. Consider the example of NASA's Saturn V rocket, which took humans to the moon. This was one of the most successful and powerful rockets ever built. Between 1967 and 1973, 13 Saturn V rockets were launched, and all 13 were successful. It was a technological triumph. Yet today, despite having the original blueprints and specifications, recreating a Saturn V would be extraordinarily difficult. This seems paradoxical. How can we have complete documentation of a technology yet be unable to reproduce it? The answer is the same lesson we learned from Archimedes. The blueprints show what was built, but they don't fully capture how it was built. They don't record the judgment calls made by experienced engineers, the workarounds developed for unexpected problems, the craft knowledge of the technicians who actually assembled the components. Many of those engineers and technicians have retired or passed away. The companies that manufactured specific components no longer exist. The entire industrial ecosystem that supported the Saturn V program has moved on to other things. The written record remains, but the practical knowledge, the tacit understanding of how to actually make it work has largely dispersed. This is Archimedes' burning mirrors playing out in the modern age. We live in an era of unprecedented information preservation. The internet has made vast amounts of knowledge accessible to anyone with a connection. We can back up data in multiple locations, ensuring it survives any single disaster. Surely we think the problem of lost knowledge has been solved, but this confidence may be misplaced. In some ways, our digital age makes knowledge more fragile, not less. Consider the problem of format obsolescence. Information stored digitally requires not just physical media but also the software to read it and the hardware to run that software. How many documents from the 1980s and 1990s are now effectively lost because they're in formats that modern computers can no longer easily open? How much early internet content has disappeared because the websites hosting it shut down and no one archived them? Even when we do preserve the data, we face another challenge: finding it again. With so much information available, relevant knowledge can effectively become lost simply by being buried under irrelevant noise. It's there somewhere, but locating it requires knowing exactly what to search for, and often knowing that it exists in the first place. Moreover, the same specialization that has driven so much modern progress also creates vulnerability. As knowledge becomes more fragmented across narrow disciplines, fewer people understand how different pieces fit together. We can know tremendous amounts about very specific topics, while losing sight of the broader context that makes that knowledge meaningful or applicable. But perhaps the most important parallel between Archimedes' era and our own involves the preservation of practical wisdom, the kind of knowledge that doesn't fit neatly into textbooks or databases. Think about traditional crafts, woodworking, metalworking, various forms of handcraft that were once common. Many of these are maintained now not because they're economically necessary. Machines can often do the same work faster and cheaper, but because individuals and communities recognize their cultural practical values and deliberately work to preserve them. This requires more than just preserving instructions. It requires maintaining communities of practice, where experienced practitioners can teach newcomers not just the steps of a process, but the judgment and sensitivity that come only with experience. How do you know when the metal is hot enough? When the wood is properly seasoned? When the mixture has the right consistency? Often the answer is something like, you can tell by the sound, or you develop a feel for it. The kind of knowledge that can only be transmitted through direct experience and guidance. The burning mirrors, if they existed as more than legend, would have required exactly this kind of practical wisdom. The theoretical principles could be written down, the geometric calculations could be preserved, but actually making them work, that would have required experienced operators who knew through practice how to compensate for variables that couldn't easily be described or predicted. When that community of practice was destroyed with the fall of Syracuse, the practical knowledge died with it. The written theory survived, but without the practical tradition to support it, later generations could never quite bridge the gap between theory and reliable application. We've traveled a long path together this evening. We began with a weapon that may or may not have existed, attributed to one of the ancient world's greatest minds. We examined the historical evidence, such as it is, and found it ambiguous, suggestive but not conclusive. We watched as the idea of burning mirrors echoed through subsequent centuries, repeatedly capturing the attention of serious scholars, yet never quite achieving reliable practical application. And along the way, we've discovered that the real mystery isn't just about mirrors and fire. It's about how knowledge itself survives or disappears, how practical wisdom can be lost even when written records remain, and how fragile our connection to the past, and perhaps to our own present knowledge, really is. Now, as we approach the end of our investigation, we need to ask one final question. What does this ancient mystery mean for us today? Not in some abstract philosophical sense, but in practical terms. What can we learn from Rome's lost technology that might help us avoid similar losses in our own time? Chapter 10. The Revelation and its Meaning. After examining all the evidence, ancient testimonies, modern experiments, historical patterns, what can we actually conclude about Archimedes' burning mirrors? The honest answer is that we cannot be certain they worked as dramatically as later sources described. The most reliable early accounts of the siege don't mention them. Modern attempts to recreate them suggest they might be possible under ideal conditions, but face significant practical limitations. Yet we also cannot dismiss them as pure fiction. Too many independent sources mention them. Too many serious scholars across too many centuries took them seriously. The theoretical principles are sound. Small-scale demonstrations have shown the basic concept works, even if scaling up to military effectiveness presents challenges. What we can say with more confidence is this: Archimedes possessed knowledge, whether about optics, engineering, or military defense, that was recognized as remarkable by his contemporaries, and that was not successfully preserved or transmitted after his death. Something was lost at Syracuse, even if we cannot precisely define what that something was, and perhaps that ambiguity is itself the revelation. Not that we've discovered what the burning mirrors truly were, but that we've discovered the limits of what we can know about the past, and by extension, the limits of what future generations might know about us. Here's what I believe the evidence points toward, though I acknowledge this interpretation is necessarily speculative. The real secret weapon of Archimedes wasn't any single device. It was his method of thinking, his ability to apply theoretical understanding to practical problems, to see connections between abstract principles and physical reality. In a world where most technology developed through trial and error, Archimedes could predict what would work before building it. In a world where craftsmen guarded their trade secrets, Archimedes published the mathematical principles underlying his discoveries. In a world where expertise meant knowing what had worked before, Archimedes demonstrated the power of understanding why things worked. This approach to knowledge, systematic, theoretical, experimental, was profoundly threatening to traditional power structures. It suggested that understanding natural principles might be more valuable than accumulated traditional wisdom. It implied that a single clever person with the right approach could outperform established experts in their own fields. When Rome conquered Syracuse and its soldiers killed Archimedes, they destroyed not just an individual genius, but a living example of this approach to knowledge. And Rome, for all its strengths, never fully recovered or replicated that way of thinking. Roman engineering achieved magnificent things, but it did so through systematic application of existing knowledge, not through Archimedes' style of theoretical innovation. The burning mirrors, whether they were fully functional weapons or something more modest, symbolized this approach. They represented applied optics, using mathematical understanding of light and reflection to create a military advantage. They showed that natural philosophy, often dismissed as impractical contemplation, could have real-world power. This ancient story resonates today because we face similar challenges in preserving knowledge and understanding in an age of rapid change. We have more information available than any previous generation, yet we struggle with questions about what knowledge is worth preserving, how to maintain practical expertise alongside theoretical understanding, and how to ensure crucial insights survive transitions between generations or technologies. The lesson of the burning mirrors isn't that we need to be more careful about documenting everything, though that helps. It's that we need to recognize the different forms knowledge takes, and the different kinds of support each form requires. Theoretical knowledge, mathematical principles, scientific laws, documented facts can be preserved in libraries and databases. But practical knowledge, craft expertise, judgment developed through experience, tacit understanding that guides skilled performance, requires communities of practice to preserve it. You can't learn this kind of knowledge from books alone. You need experienced practitioners to guide you through the development of your own expertise. And perhaps most importantly, we need to preserve the connection between theory and practice, between abstract understanding and real-world application. This was Archimedes' great strength. He could move fluidly between pure mathematics and practical engineering. His theoretical work informed his inventions, and his practical problems drove his theoretical investigations. This integration of theory and practice is easy to lose. Academic disciplines become increasingly specialized and theoretical. Practical fields focus on immediate results without theoretical depth. The dialogue between the two weakens, and both suffer as a result. So we return to where we began, but with deeper understanding. Rome's mysterious lost technology, whether it was exactly as described or something more modest, represents a question that extends far beyond ancient mirrors and military weapons. It asks us to consider what we're losing from our own era, what knowledge we're failing to preserve, what connections we're allowing to break. It reminds us that preservation isn't automatic, that knowledge can slip away while we're not paying attention, and that sometimes we don't realize what we've lost until it's too late to recover it. The burning mirrors remain mysterious, not because ancient people were deliberately secretive, but because knowledge is inherently fragile. It depends on particular circumstances, specific communities, individual practitioners who understand not just the what but the how and why. Break any link in that chain, and the knowledge can be lost, leaving only hints and legends for later generations to puzzle over. We stand now where Anthemius stood in the 6th century, where Islamic scholars stood in the 10th, where Renaissance engineers stood in the 15th, looking back at something we know was once understood, trying to piece together from fragmentary evidence what has been lost. Each generation has had to rediscover what earlier generations knew, or thought they knew, or partially understood. Perhaps this is simply the human condition. Perhaps knowledge is meant to be rediscovered by each age, reinterpreted through contemporary understanding, rebuilt rather than simply inherited. Perhaps the mystery itself, the questions, the investigation, the attempt to understand, is more valuable than any final answer we might reach. What we've explored tonight is more than the story of one ancient weapon or one remarkable mind. It's a meditation on the nature of knowledge itself, how it's created, how it's preserved, how it's lost, and what those losses mean for civilizations across time. Archimedes represents a particular kind of genius that appears rarely in history, the person who can bridge theory and practice, who can see the practical implications of abstract ideas, who can apply systematic thinking to apparently intractable problems. When such individuals appear, they can transform their societies, but they also create a kind of knowledge that's peculiarly vulnerable to loss. The burning mirrors, whatever their ultimate reality, serve as a symbol of this vulnerability. They remind us that sophistication doesn't guarantee survival, that being written down doesn't guarantee preservation, that impressive achievements can fade into uncertainty, leaving later generations to wonder what was really accomplished and how it was done. But this story also offers hope. Despite the losses, despite the gaps in the record, despite the passage of 2 millennia, we're still asking these questions, still investigating, still trying to understand. The human drive to comprehend, to recreate, to bridge the gaps in our knowledge, this persists across generations and centuries. If there's a practical lesson to draw from this exploration, it's this: We should be more conscious about how we preserve not just information, but understanding. We should value communities of practice that maintain tacit knowledge. We should work to keep connections strong between theoretical disciplines and practical fields. We should document not just what we do, but how and why we do it. And perhaps most importantly, we should maintain some humility about how much we really know and how secure that knowledge really is. The Byzantines lost Greek fire, despite having every reason to preserve it. We've lost the ability to make Roman concrete, despite its obvious utility. Each generation assumes its achievements are permanent, and each generation is partly wrong. This doesn't mean we should despair about the fragility of knowledge. Rather, it means we should be more intentional about preservation, more thoughtful about what we're passing on to future generations, and more grateful for what previous generations managed to preserve despite all obstacles. The scholars who kept copying Archimedes' mathematical works through the Middle Ages, when such texts might have seemed impractical luxuries, they're heroes of human knowledge. Because of their dedication, we still have access to some of Archimedes' genius, even if we've lost other parts of it. Every generation needs such dedicated preservers. I want to end with a thought that might seem counterintuitive. Perhaps the fact that burning mirrors remain mysterious is itself valuable. Not every question needs a definitive answer. Not every puzzle needs to be completely solved. The mystery of the burning mirrors has prompted 2,000 years of investigation. It's inspired experiments in optics, motivated historical research, encouraged people to think deeply about how technology is created and lost. The question has been, in its own way, more generative than any answer might be. This doesn't mean we should stop investigating, but it does mean we can appreciate the journey of inquiry itself, the careful weighing of evidence, the consideration of alternative explanations, the humility in the face of historical ambiguity. These are valuable intellectual habits, and cultivating them might matter more than reaching any single conclusion. The burning mirrors teach us to be curious, to be thorough, to acknowledge uncertainty while still seeking understanding. They teach us that history is not a collection of facts but an ongoing conversation between past and present. They remind us that some of the most interesting questions are those we must revisit repeatedly, from different angles, with each generation bringing new insights and new tools to bear. So we conclude our exploration this evening, with the mystery intact but our understanding deepened. We may not know exactly what Archimedes created, but we know more about why it was lost and what that loss represents. We may not be certain whether burning mirrors worked as described, but we understand better the challenges of preserving complex knowledge across time and the patterns by which such knowledge disappears. Perhaps the lesson here isn't about secrecy or weapons or ancient technology at all. It's about how easily important things can slip from memory, not through any dramatic catastrophe, but through the simple failure to actively preserve them. It's about how knowledge that seems secure can prove fragile. It's about how each generation must choose what to carry forward and what to let fade away, and how those choices shape what future generations will know about us. The burning mirrors of Archimedes remain mysterious, but the patterns they reveal about knowledge, preservation and loss are clear enough. And those patterns are worth understanding, because they're still operating in our own time, still shaping what we know and what we'll pass on. Thank you for spending this time exploring this ancient mystery with me. These long-form investigations require patience, both from you as a viewer and from me as a researcher, but I believe they offer rewards that shorter, more sensational presentations cannot match. If you found value in this careful, thoughtful exploration, if you appreciate having space to think deeply about historical questions without being rushed to conclusions, you're welcome to subscribe to this channel. We focus on these kinds of nuanced historical investigations, stories where the questions themselves are worth exploring even when definitive answers remain elusive. I also maintain an active community tab where many of you continue these discussions, share additional sources you've discovered, and raise new questions that sometimes lead to future investigations. The conversation doesn't end when the video concludes. Some of the most insightful observations about previous topics have come from viewers who added their own expertise and perspectives in the comments and community discussions. For this particular topic, I've compiled a list of the primary ancient sources I referenced, the relevant passages from Polybius, Plutarch, Livy, and others, along with citations for the modern scholarly work and experimental reports I mentioned. You'll find those in the description below for anyone who wishes to continue their own research. If you have thoughts about how to interpret the evidence we've examined, or if you've come across sources or perspectives I haven't considered, I'd genuinely be interested to hear them. The comments section works best when it becomes a space for thoughtful exchange rather than quick reactions, and many of you have demonstrated that such exchanges are possible even on digital platforms. Until next time, I encourage you to remain curious about the gaps in our historical knowledge. Sometimes what we don't know, and the reasons we don't know it, tell us as much as what we do know. These absences in the record, these mysteries like the burning mirrors, invite us to think more deeply about how knowledge works and what it means to truly understand something. Thank you for your time and attention. They're the most valuable things you can offer, and I don't take them for granted.